Hi, and welcome to Future Thinking from Stylus. I'm your New York-based host, Amelia Miranda-Williams, an editor here at Stylus's, currently remote, US office. Today we'll be speaking to Nancy Zhang, head of partnerships with BorderX Lab, a platform that allows global brands to sell directly to Chinese shoppers without the need for an external agency or China-based team. Also here with us is Saisangeeth Daswani, Stylus's very own head of advisory for fashion, beauty, and APAC. Welcome to you both.
Hi.
Our topic of the day is China. We'll be discussing how to tap into the country's luxury and retail markets and what content is resonating with today's Chinese millennials. And of course, we'll examine how these opportunities are changing as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So Nancy, can you start by telling us a little bit about BorderX Lab? How do you work with brands and how do you help them cater their offering to the Chinese market?
Sure. So BorderX Lab is a mobile app, and we have an app that actually takes the three pillars of customer kind of engagement that we have. So one, content is key. So we have a content platform that uses our in-house editors who work with brands and our retailers to create content that tells stories and kind of shows the brand heritage, shall we say, of American and European merchants. And we also have in-house content labs. So we actually have a beauty lab that we do swatching and we do reviews, and really the reviews actually is a great way for us to engage our consumers, because our consumers on our app are quite happy to share their responses. They like to take photos of their products. They like to talk about what products work and doesn't work for them. So we have this user-generated content, which kind of engages our community. So we have this content in this community, and then we really have the commerce that fuels the brand kind of conversion. So with all this chatter about a specific product or a specific line, we give the consumer the ability to actually very easily click to buy. So we look like this very glossy content platform on the outside, but really on the inside, we have this deep kind of technology that is able to serve very strong content that works with the consumer's preferences, their browsing history, and also we look at the region that the consumer is from. And also we have actually quite a nice balance of male and female users on our app. And one third of our users on our app are male. And we have quite a lot of sports and streetwear, sneakers related content for them. And so it's actually quite interesting that we're able to engage both the millennial male and females.
And so can you give us an example of a brand that's seen success on BorderX? What have they been doing? What do they look like?
Sure. We actually have this really great platform for both beauty and for fashion. So beauty, I would say Pat McGrath has done an extremely well on our platform, and it's unique because she has really good video content that we use, and for her tutorials, and also her interview with Naomi about the eyeliner. Like, this is all stuff that really resonates with our consumers because it's short, but it's very punchy and useful kind of information. It's not just like a product shot. So when we launched with Pat McGrath last year, we actually saw very, very strong results. From a fashion perspective, Alexander Wang has been on our platform for quite a few years now. And one of my favorite ways to talk about how Alexander Wang works with us is that we really look at this as an omni-channel kind of multi-channel strategy. So Alexander Wang has retail stores, his own, and also he has wholesale accounts with all of the department stores in Asia. Plus he has his own e-commerce in China, and he also has his other channels, like for example, Tmall, and he also works with us. So in this kind of multi-pronged strategy, what we bring to the table really is the mobile engagement, part, where we're really able to reach millennials in the way or in the channel that they want to be reached, and that is by far in China through a mobile device and not necessarily through a desktop. And the other is that we partner with them on content, and that content gets distributed across our 15 million users. And we do have quite a high concentration in first tier cities, but we also have a very strong concentration in second tier cities as well, and third tier cities. So we're able to service, for example, customers who don't necessarily have the opportunity to walk into an Alexander Wang store here in New York, or in Beijing or Shanghai.
And can you quickly explain to our listeners what the different tier cities mean in China?
Sure, sure. Yeah, so when we look at cities in China, I mean, any small city in China has 10, 20 million people in it. So there's this the component of first tier cities is really the major travel hubs like Shanghai, Beijing, where there are a huge concentration of people, and also a huge concentration of brand investment. So there's flagship stores, there's retail stores, there's very high-end malls, and there's basically the consumer has their choice, pick of the gamut, and what they like to buy. And the availability of American products or European products is actually quite strong. So it's not necessarily because they can't get that product they're looking for that they're coming onto our app in the tier 1 city, but that is true sometimes in the tier 2 and or tier 3 city, where China is just so expansive that for a lot of brands it would be cost prohibitive to open stores all across China. So we're actually quite strong in servicing tier 2 and tier 3 cities, because those are places where our consumers, what we say is our consumers are looking for cross-border American and European lifestyle. So they're looking for stuff that they can't necessarily find, even if it is an American brand, they can't necessarily find it in the flagship in China, because a lot of times product is designed to be specialized for that specific market. And sometimes our customers want that American product, or they want that limited edition product. I'll give you a good example is Alexander Wang in the US on his e-commerce had a kind of marijuana related collaboration that they did not produce or send to China because of certain sensitivities, but actually there was quite a lot of interest and demand in some of that kind of look. So we were able to service the customers that are looking for those kind of limited edition drops directly here through the US site of Alexander Wang.
And so obviously brands like Alexander Wang and, as you mentioned earlier, Pat McGrath are quite luxury brands and companies. So what do you think the opportunity for luxury is among China markets at the moment?
Oh, absolutely. So when we look at kind of the distribution of customers kind of globally, right now we say that China, or global Chinese, so we're talking about not just people who live in China, we serve what we call the global Chinese. So that also means Chinese Americans that live here in the US, Chinese Canadians, Chinese who live abroad in Europe and in the Middle East as well. So when we look at the global Chinese kind of distribution, we look at probably 30 to 40% of the luxury customer base is global Chinese. Some of it is travel retail. But if you look at kind of future growth, right, 80% of future growth comes from China. So we're quite saturated, especially when it comes to e-commerce. We're quite saturated from an e-commerce perspective in luxury here in the US. Europe is still a little underpenetrated. I think we can do better in Europe, but China really is the next big market, right? Not just the 2 billion people, but also highly, highly engaged millennials who have 3 times more screen time than I would say an American millennial. And they have that lifestyle component where they're the first generation that hasn't been through famine or revolution. So their comfort level for spending and their comfort level for kind of conspicuous consumption is quite high. So, even in this, I think we're going to transition into COVID response, we saw in January, when China started shutting down, we saw that there was a very high spike in engagement, not necessarily in purchase, but in engagement, because you can imagine everybody's bored, they're at home, they're playing on their phones, right? So there's this hunger for engagement, hunger for content that's authentic. And we saw this kind of spike in engagement, and we also saw beauty continue to steadily sell. So we're seeing, okay, people aren't really going out, so they're not buying buying shoes or bags. But beauty is still going strong because there's a self-care component. We also saw a huge increase in wellness, in supplements and self-care. And then as we kind of went into March, and as kind of the rest of the world started going into shutdown in quarantine, China was 2 months ahead. So now the Chinese consumer has rebounded in this kind of phenomenon that we call revenge buying. And really what it was is revenge buying kind of refers to this pent-up demand for Western product when China used to be closed off. So this is not a new term that we just invented. This is something that Chinese have had this history of this hunger for product that they have been closed off to, right? So this kind of revenge buying 2.0 we see is that this hunger for consumption that they hadn't had in 2 or 3 months, now that China is kind of back to normal. We always say our Shanghai office has never been happier to be stuck in traffic, because it means things are back to normal. So now that there's, people are going out again, people are eating out again, we saw a huge spike in revenge buying, and luxury actually took a nice big chunk of that. And we're seeing that investment in kind of products that maybe they treat themselves for going through something that was difficult, and now they're able to come back and really to come back into this market and get something really lovely to kind of jumpstart the new normal, if you will.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I feel like we've been hearing a lot about revenge buying here in the US and in the UK, and it's very much been focused, and this is something that's happening in China, Chinese consumers are doing, and that other brands should be looking forward to really tap these consumers. And I'm curious if you both think that this is something that could translate to other markets as well. Like, will we see people coming out of lockdown in Europe and the US doing this, or is the concept of revenge buying really rooted in, as you're mentioning, the hunger for products that cannot be purchased in a specific location?
That's a good question. I mean, personally, when we look at the US, or in New York in particular, we look at retailers, right? And we think, what's the new normal going to look like when we open back up, right? Are people going to be in restaurants? Are people going to be in the malls again, right? We have this beautiful new mall down by Hudson Yard, right? Are people going to want to go into a store again? And we used to, I remember just in our last Decoded conference, we talked about experiences, right? How brands and retailers are really shaping experiences and using experiences to tell a story. Well, now our consumer is going to want to have an in-store experience, right? I think that even with kind of this demand, it'll shift. I think that people will continue to buy. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we're all humans, and we consume for many reasons. But for the most part, there's a replenishment need, right? So we've completely lost the spring summer season, right? So spring summer's come and gone, and we're going into May now. And in May we have Memorial Day, and that's when sales start happening. So I think there's going to be strong promotions. I think that retailers have a lot of product that they need to move, so they are going to be very sensitive towards the right price in the right way to move this product. And I think that consumers are going to buy again, but it's how are they going to buy, right? And what I always advise our brands here is not just for the China market, but for all of their markets, to consider diversifying their channels, right? So we saw that during COVID kind of lockdown in the US and in Europe, that the brands who were very strong in e-commerce, the brands who really had a very strong brand identity and who were able to communicate in a way that engaged the consumer during the lockdown, are the ones that are winning. And when you come out of that lockdown, everybody else is going to come back into this market. And I think that the brands who had the consumer's attention during the lockdown are going to win kind of the consumer's favor when we come back out.
And Stylus and Keith, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, how cautious do you think Chinese consumers are going to be as the new normal really solidifies? And do you think their priorities will be changing? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, Nancy's talked a little bit about the revenge buying 2.0. And it's interesting because we've already started to see some sort of inklings of revenge buying. When the Hermes store in Guangzhou opened, they sold, I think there was record-breaking sales of like 2.7 million
Yes.
in one day.
Yes.
But I do think that, the experience of it, they did do a lot to ensure that, you know, people who were in the store that day had amazing influences. On Little Red Book, which is a platform, a social platform in China, we saw a lot of people kind of capture, you know, different stories and share what was going on within the store. They also then kind of had rare bags from all over shipped to that location so that people could buy sort of these one-of-a-kind bags. Equally, we've seen people, you know, line up outside of Chanel. And I think that China and different countries in APAC also have sort of had slightly a longer time to, you know, adjust to the impact of coronavirus. And I think these countries have really sort of learned from the hard lessons of SARS, because that was so prominent in Asia, you know, almost a decade ago. And I think when a lot of retailers and brands look to SARS, you know, they feel like, oh, will the, you know, the recovery period or will the recovery look the same? And I think that looking at SARS might not necessarily give you an entire picture. You know, you can take inspiration from that for sure, but you know, leading into the lockdown and sort of coronavirus in general, we saw that, you know, the world sort of economic backdrop was really different. We even started to see some reverse globalization. So I think we need to think about how the mindsets are really changing as a result of this sort of longer period of dealing with this pandemic. So that psychological impact is really going to start to constrain some consumers, you know, compared to when we previously seen, and also maybe constrain them for a little bit longer. Research actually shows that the recovery period, or to actually see consumers shop like they were, or in similar stances like they were before the virus, it would take about 6 months or more. But that's not to say that, you know, I think one thing about Chinese consumers is they were already really big avid spenders compared to consumers across the globe. So I kind of think that they're almost heightened a little bit compared to the way global consumers are shopping. But I do think that priorities are really gonna change. You know, millennials especially are probably giving more attention to the importance of saving. With these restricted budgets, we'll start to see consumers really want their products to work much harder, and also across different disciplines as well. So, you know, in apparel, it could be apparel with a heightened level of functionality, or reversible apparel items. Or in the home, we see a lot of these like compact home products that could work on the go, but equally in the home as well. You know, so it's really thinking about those propositions and the properties of products and how these could essentially connect with consumers' perception of value.
Yeah, and when we look at the data of what consumers are looking for on our app, what we found is that post-COVID, even now, and it's translated to after the quarantine, spending on wellness and on kind of active wear, which kind of relates to working on one's body and, you know, soul, body and soul, right? So wellness has really increased and then stayed there. So we did see a slight drop in apparel and handbags, you know, during quarantine, and beauty kind of stayed its course. Once China kind of came out of that quarantine, beauty spiked. Apparel and footwear kind of started to come back up again, but really wellness stayed really high. And the other one for us is home products, right? We haven't really focused a lot on home products on our app because it is kind of difficult to ship kind of large products or technology that have wiring is challenging between the two different electrical cords that need to go back and forth between APAC and Western Europe. But we do see a lot more interest in it because I think all of us realize as we're in quarantine that investment in the comfort of your home has made a big impact on kind of your life quality. And I think that those trends are not going to go away post-COVID. So what we're seeing, or what we're looking for, are these new direct-to-consumer brands, like you said, that really has this like high functionality and value. What we do think, what we're going to go into this kind of Q2 is pricing, right? Really am very interested in seeing pricing, because I think that I would caution brands and retailers to think about their pricing strategy. It's a double-edged sword. If you're kind of sitting on a lot of inventory and you need to kind of convert to cash so that you can kind of move on with the season, it's totally understandable. But at the same time, if you price too low and we kind of go into this liquidation phase. We don't want to train the consumer into feeling that once they get this deal, they're can continue to be deal hungry for the rest of the season. So in order to really get out of this deal hunger, we have to have really, really compelling full price products launch in the fall. Things that consumers are going to want to buy full price, that they're going to think is special, and that they actually want to invest in going into the fall season.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the fact that, because consumers are thinking of value, it really does connect with that mindset of the fact that they want to invest in themselves and their surroundings. So that really speaks to your point around like wellness and home. But also, a lot of, our clients are also asking us about things around pricing and what are interesting ways to kind of work around that. And I completely agree. And I think the fashion industry sort of moved beyond, the phases of sort of big discounts. So what are some sort of small, but, smart sort of tactics you can really employ to ensure that when people are shopping online or on social commerce or on mobile, like how can they ensure that those baskets are being converted to sales, So small discounts on like higher ticketed items. So like 10% off on like $150 or 20 or 15% off on like $250 or something like that. Promotions that really don't decrease the general, they don't greatly decrease that sort of average order value. I think that's key to sort of consider going forward.
Sure. And what we're seeing also from a product strategy perspective is for brands, and I really think that this brands are going to come out winning in COVID. Unfortunately, retailers have a lot on their plate, and what we're seeing is for brands, this direct to consumer push, right? To have a direct relationship with the consumer is really helping. A few reasons. One, when the brand goes directly to the consumer, their markup is higher. So they're able to have a stronger profitability. Like if you can convert, say, 1/3 or a half of your sales base, from wholesale into direct to consumer, there's really two really big wins. One is that you're communicating and you're having a direct relationship with that consumer. You get a better understanding of their preferences. And two is profitability goes up, right? And with that added margin, what I'm seeing and what I would advise brands to do is to create a robust subset of products, right? So there's the kind of home runs that are staples that everybody loves. And then there's kind of higher end products that really show off the story or talk about the story of the brand. But then there's also should be a certain level of medium priced or more accessibly priced product that may have potentially been created just for direct to consumer. We see Marc Jacobs as a very strong product proposition in this way, that they create direct to consumer priced product that's available only on the Marc Jacobs website. And we're seeing that more and more, is that different channels have kind of more of this channel limited edition products, right? And I really do think that that's the way to go. So if we're able to create pricing that's meant for direct to consumer, there's a lot more volume and margin to play with, and it gives value to the consumer, and it also gives the consumer a very good reason to come direct to you, the brand, as opposed to through a retailer experience. And not to say that retailers are going to go away. I think this idea of curation and this idea of experience is going to continue. It's just how will retailers be able to translate this idea of curation and experience and a viewpoint, right? How they're able to translate that into a digital sphere, I think is going to be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that also taps into so many trends that we're looking at in terms of what people want in different areas and how we're thinking about just changing priorities in general. And I'm curious, you mentioned the different things that people are buying nowadays and also the, sensitivity to pricing. Has this been really broad across all cities in China, or is it dependent on certain tiers are more price sensitive and certain tiers are looking for certain categories more than others?
Well, what we're seeing actually is that tier 1 cities are bouncing back faster than our tier 2s. And that makes sense. I mean, tier 1 probably has the majority of what we call laptop jockeys, which kind of like us, right? People who are working from home, they're able to continue with their work, they're being paid, and they have this ability to continue shopping and consuming, and that this drive, because as soon as the cities pop back up, then the re-socialization starts to happen again. I think tier 2 and tier 3 cities are going to take a little bit longer, and we're probably going to see that in the US as well, because this is really the places where it may be hit a little bit harder for that kind of the consumers that may have taken a more economic hit, I would say. And we see that also here in New York, right? We see like luxury is going to continue to be luxury, right? Cartier supposedly had the Christmas-like numbers, and we had Black Friday-like numbers. So that luxury buyer is going to continue to buy. But what we do is we also really want to make sure that we serve that middle class, that kind of midsection of this curve, to say, okay, so the midsection of this curve is extremely price sensitive right now. Not to say that price is the only thing. There's definitely about price to value, I would say, but they really need a good reason to buy. They really need, as opposed to saving for rent, for food, for essentials, right? We really need to give them a strong reason to buy another pair of jeans again, or another boot again. And I think that that's where we're going to see a little bit of struggle. Luxury is going to come out, okay here, and I think that we really need to think about kind of in the mid-tier level how we can really stimulate the demand for products. And not to say that that's our only priority, but we want to make sure that also for us, someone who's come from retail, or I've spent 13 years of my career in retail and fashion, and we kind of think like, is what's going to happen? And even in New York, we look at restaurants, bars, stores. These probably employ 80% of the workforce here in New York, right? Of the people who actually work in a physical location. And in order for them to start participating in the economy again, they need to have jobs. And how do we create those jobs? Well, hopefully everybody kind of comes back to normal and starts going back to their favorite restaurants again and starts buying again, so that we can kind of kickstart this economy again.
Yeah, I think it's really about thinking about those waves of spending. Every brand's consumers will have different waves of spending. So it's really about tapping into, shopper insights and things like that to really understand, what the consumer would need. But also, to Nancy's point, I think finding a way to make that, to entice consumers a little bit more would be really important. You can do that beyond product, thinking about the experience. Is there an opportunity to elevate that experience through, let's say, convenience? We talked about offering discounts earlier. What about enhancing delivery, or even making payments more seamless? So I think that kind of makes it more holistic for the consumer as well, and would give them a little bit more incentive to buy.
Absolutely. And loyalty, right? Really for rewarding loyalty, right? So
Yeah.
I think what our next big project that we're working on our app is having each individual, a lot of our individual partners and brands already have a loyalty system in-house, but really how do we help them enhance it and then bring it onto this mobile platform? I think a lot of times we look at kind of CAC, everybody really cares a lot about customer acquisition costs, right? And of all the money and time and energy and kind of love that we put into acquiring a consumer, I think that we don't think as much about how do we retain this consumer, yeah. Right? And really our best customer is a returning customer. So I think rewarding loyalty and also really providing a lot of value to those who are purchasing in this kind of first wave is going to do a lot.
And so thinking about, retaining loyalty, engaging customers, what kind of content are you, Nancy, finding resonates most with Chinese consumers at the moment?
So two things Chinese consumers love. One is really an authentic voice, right? So they want to hear your authentic voice. Glossy advertising is not necessarily the thing that's going to move them anymore. Here in the US, we're seeing influencers are not necessarily so in touch with what consumers are looking for. In China, we're seeing a little less of that. I think the KOLs in China are doing a very good job of talking about how kind of being a little bit more in touch and talking about, their experiences under quarantine. So I think influencers are not going to go away, but I think the really authentic influencers are the ones that are catching the hearts of the people. Brand authenticity, I think, is really important. And the other one is content that's made directly for them. I mean, I think if you look about it, in any customer base wants to know that they're valued, right, as a customer. So Chinese consumers really appreciate when, in the right tone, brands are speaking to them in a way that they feel are understood and respected. I think it's really important that Chinese consumers feel that people in general all over the world know what they want and are able to deliver what they want without kind of pandering to a specific kind of stereotype of China or Chinese consumption.
Yeah. You know, when the lockdown first happened, obviously it was just first in China. The rest of the world was still kind of operating as normal. I loved one of the things that Nike had done. Nike did this WeChat mini program where they created these like little workout videos on how you can work out at home with like water bottles and things like that, you know, so they're still kind of pushing their core message around fitness, performance, and wellness and health. But, you know, they're really thinking about what that Chinese consumer is going through in that moment. And I think that's what a lot of Chinese consumers really crave to see from some of these global brands.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with you there.
That's excellent. I love that idea. I mean, my weights are certainly starting to feel lighter after all of this. Are there any other good brand examples that you've seen for how brands can tap e-commerce and social media, especially at a time like this? I mean, the strategy must be quite different from regular times.
Yes, yes. I think one thing that is really important at this time is kind of voice sensitivity. I mean, we've already kind of touched upon this, and I think this like idea of we're all in it together, and we are going to get through this, and this is how we're going to do it. Kind of treat yourself. It's okay to not be okay. That kind of messaging, I think, has really resonated well with consumers. This focus on mental health and well-being and how brands are there to support, I think, has really resonated well with consumers as well.
I think those sort of tones around optimism and positivity are really the ones that are cutting through the noise, because there's so much, you know, fake news out there. We don't know what, you know, people are drinking disinfectants and telling people that they can eat garlic and be cured from the coronavirus. So it's really kind of cutting through all of that and really getting to what brands could actually do to make consumers sort of feel better and feel safe and feel protected almost.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so looking forward to, the rest of the year, hopefully we'll all be back in our offices soon. But in terms of brands, do you think that there's any advice that you'd give on re-strategizing their retail program for the rest of the year? Should they bank on China versus the rest of the world? What's your outlook here?
I would say China is 2 to 3 months ahead of the rest of the world at this point. So absolutely, we're banking on China. China has been doing very, very well cross-border. And so we're having a very good Q1, Q2. We had a very good Q1, Q2 is coming up, and it's doing very, very well as well. So absolutely, I would say bank on China, bank on cross-border, bank on mobile technology, bank on e-commerce, and really bank on, I think the most important thing is bank on having an authentic direct connection with the consumer. I think that that's really shown to be a huge plus in this time, that consumers do want to have engagement, because at a time when there is very little stimulus, right? People are craved for stimulus, but there's so much being kind of thrown, and cutting through that noise, I think, is going to be really key. The other thing that I really want to kind of bring up or mention is that we may see a second wave, right? So I think it's behooves us all to think about what a retail strategy would look like for Christmas, for Q4, for Black Friday. Like, Q4 is the most important quarter for clothing retailers, for any kind of selling consumption. What would Q4 look like if there was a second wave, right? Prepare, I think, hope for the best and prepare for the worst. So I think if there was a second wave, right, this kind of hunkering down during holiday season, how can you cut through the noise, and how can we engage consumers during the holiday season? I think that strategy is key, and a big part of that, I truly believe, is mobile.
Yeah.
I mean, how much time people spend on mobile versus desktop in the US is still kind of shifting, but in the rest of the world, particularly in China, mobile is the only way that you can cut across. I mean, we don't even collect email anymore. I know that we've talked about this before. Email is still one of the highest conversion, if not the highest conversion channel for a lot of American brands, but email is just a completely irrelevant part of the consumer journey in the APAC region, because everybody uses their phones for transaction. So I really do think that kind of shifting gears into direct-to-consumer and into brands engaging their consumers on a mobile device is going to be key in Q4.
Yeah, in China, and actually with a lot of developing countries, they sort of skip having like desktops and laptops, and their access to the internet just goes straight from mobile. And I think that's why, like, that really speaks to that tier 2, tier 3, and even tier 4 city consumers, where that emerging middle class is really, really growing. But bringing back, something you said, Nancy, earlier, that point around like having a multi-pronged approach is so important, because yes, mobile is definitely a key sort of area that we're already starting to see people, shift their budgets towards, because mobile kind of, it's sort of entering your personal space. The mobile is like an extension of your hand,
Yes.
but also then thinking beyond just, driving traffic in your store, because clearly that's not even going to be a possibility anymore. What can you do on e-commerce? Are you doing anything on social? How easy is it for people to buy on social? What are you doing on mobile? It's just like, I feel like there's been so much work for consumers, but I think brands now need to take that ownership and really think about how they can, think from a consumer first perspective. I think that's a sort of good way to really think about it.
Sure. And I want to just touch up on one more thing, which I think is live stream. I think we've seen here in the US, at least, that this comfort of switching, everybody almost immediately overnight switched to doing yoga live stream, Pilates live stream, all our meetings are on Zoom now, right? So this kind of receptiveness towards live stream, I think COVID has really pushed brands in the wellness space to convert right away into a live stream environment. And I think that brands, retail brands, fashion brands can do the same. I think, if we do need to really think about a Q4 strategy, I do think that live stream and video content is going to be key for that.
Excellent. Well, from my little box to yours, I'd like to thank my guests, Nancy Zhang and Saizengeeth Daswani, and thank everyone for listening. I hope you'll join us next time for more future thinking from Stylus.